The terminal was busy that morning. Businessmen with briefcases, families with kids, travelers hurrying to catch early flights. In the middle of it all, Steven Seagal walked quietly toward Gate A12. No entourage, no sunglasses, no Hollywood flair. Just a black jacket, jeans, and a calm presence that made people turn their heads without knowing why. He'd chosen to fly commercial, something he did often when he wanted peace. The flight was headed to Los Angeles, and Seagal had simply wanted time to think, to read, to rest. As he boarded, the flight attendant smiled politely. He nodded back, his tone gentle. "Good morning." Inside the first-class cabin, Steven placed his small leather bag in the overhead compartment and took his window seat. He leaned back, adjusting his reading glasses as passengers continued boarding. A man in a crisp gray suit stopped beside him, a confident, loud-talking type in his 40s. Gold watch flashing, phone in hand. He glanced at Steven, then smirked. "Excuse me," the man said with an exaggerated tone. "I think this is first class. You sure you're in the right seat, buddy?" Steven looked up, calm and polite. "Yes," he said simply, holding up his ticket. The man chuckled. "Right. Must have been an upgrade or something." He tossed his carry-on above, sighing dramatically as if he'd been wronged by having to sit next to someone who didn't look the part. As passengers settled in, he leaned slightly towards Steven. "So what do you do?" he asked with mock curiosity. Steven smiled faintly. "I work in film," the man laughed. "Film? Oh, like those indie guys trying to make it big. You don't look like an actor, pal." Steven said nothing, returning to his book, The Art of Peace. The man shook his head, muttering, "Unbelievable. They'll let anyone in first class these days." Across the aisle, a young woman heard it and frowned. A few passengers exchanged glances. One whispered, "That guy doesn't know who he's talking to." But Steven didn't react. His calm made the arrogance beside him look louder. What Steven said next would make everyone on that plane rethink the word respect. The flight attendants moved through the aisle with their usual pre-flight energy and polite smiles, efficient motions, and that calm tone used to keep every traveler at ease. But near seat 2A, tension was starting to quietly build. The man in the gray suit who had already mocked Steven moments earlier seemed unable to leave things alone. He kept glancing sideways, clearly trying to provoke a reaction. Steven, meanwhile, sat peacefully, eyes fixed on his book. When the attendant passed by offering drinks, the man gestured first. "Scotch, neat, top shelf if you got it." Then he pointed lazily toward Steven. "And get my friend here some water. He looks like he could use it." A few passengers glanced over. It was subtle, but everyone could sense the disrespect behind his tone. Steven didn't look up. "Water's fine," he said quietly. The man chuckled. "Thought so. You look like a water guy." The attendant gave a polite but awkward smile and hurried away. As the plane began taxiing, the man leaned back, stretching as if he owned the cabin. He began talking loudly on his phone before takeoff, ignoring the repeated announcements to switch devices off. Yeah, I'm in first class," he bragged, right next to some old movie guy or something. "You'd laugh if you saw him." Steven turned his head slightly, but not enough to engage. There was no anger in his face, just stillness. Once the engines roared and the plane lifted off the runway, the man finally ended his call. He looked at Steven again, clearly annoyed that his neighbor wouldn't play along. "You from around here?" he asked with the tone of someone interrogating rather than conversing. Steven finally met his eyes. His voice was steady. "No, but I've been here long enough to learn patience." The man smirked. "Patience, huh? You one of those meditation types?" Steven closed his book gently. "Something like that. That only seemed to irritate the man more. Man, I swear, every time I fly I get stuck next to some weirdo. You could be a retired janitor for all I know." Across the aisle, the young woman from earlier suddenly recorded on her phone, not for drama, but because she sensed something about Steven's calm, that it wasn't ordinary. When the attendant returned with drinks, she addressed Steven first. "Here's your water, sir." "Thank you," he said softly with a brief nod. Then she turned to the suited man. "Your scotch, sir." He took it, muttering, "Finally," before continuing his commentary under his breath. "You know," he said after a pause, swirling his glass, "you remind me of one of those fake tough guys in movies, the kind that talk about peace but couldn't fight their way out of a parking ticket." Steven smiled faintly. "Maybe, but real strength isn't about fighting. The man laughed, loud enough for others to hear. Spare me the fortune cookie wisdom. You're lucky they even let you in here. A hush fell over the few passengers within earshot. A businessman 2 rows ahead frowned but didn't intervene. The flight attendant at the galley noticed, unsure whether to step in or let it pass. Steven remained motionless, resting his hands on his knees. His calm was so firm it almost unnerved the man beside him. Finally, Steven spoke, his voice low but clear enough for those around to hear. We all show the world who we are, not by what we have, but how we treat people we think are beneath us. The man froze, caught off guard. A few murmurs rippled through the cabin. Someone softly said, "Wow." Steven reopened his book and returned to his reading as if nothing had happened. The suited man stared at him for a moment, visibly unsettled. For the first time, he didn't have a comeback. Silence filled the air. The engines hummed. Outside, clouds drifted by. Inside, something had shifted. A quiet respect had started forming among the passengers who had witnessed it. Have you ever seen someone get judged unfairly in public? Comment below, what did you do? The flight had reached cruising altitude. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked off, and the hum of conversation filled the first-class cabin again. Flight attendants began serving breakfast trays, warm croissants, fruit bowls, and coffee that smelled stronger than it tasted. Steven sat quietly, eyes on the clouds outside. The man beside him, however, still hadn't learned his lesson. Though quieter now, his energy was still sharp, defensive, uneasy. Every few minutes he'd glance at Steven as if trying to reclaim his sense of control. When the attendant passed the food trays, she smiled at Steven first. Would you like the vegetarian option, sir? That would be fine, Steven replied softly. The suited man scoffed. Figures, he muttered. Vegetarian. Of course. Steven ignored him again. The man wasn't used to being ignored. He leaned closer. You think you're better than me or something? Sitting there with your little book, quoting life advice, Steven turned slightly, his gaze calm but firm. I don't think I'm better than anyone. Sure doesn't look that way, the man shot back. You've got this holier-than-thou attitude. Who do you think you are, some kind of monk? Steven didn't flinch. Just a man trying to travel in peace. A few rows back, passengers were starting to pay attention again. The young woman who'd been filming earlier adjusted her camera slightly, her expression tense. The man laughed bitterly. Travel in peace, huh? You sound like one of those washed-up actors trying to stay relevant. Steven's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in patience. You seem angry, he said. Sometimes anger comes from pain. You might want to look at that. That line hit harder than any insult could have. The man's expression hardened. Don't play therapist with me. He reached for his coffee, knocking the edge of his tray. Some spilled on Steven's sleeve. Oh, great, Steven murmured, dabbing it with a napkin. The flight had reached cruising altitude. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked off, and the hum of conversation filled the first-class cabin again. Flight attendants began serving breakfast trays, warm croissants, fruit bowls, and coffee that smelled stronger than it tasted. Steven sat quietly, eyes on the clouds outside. The man beside him, however, still hadn't learned his lesson. Though quieter now, his energy was still sharp, defensive, uneasy. Every few minutes he'd glance at Steven as if trying to reclaim his sense of control. When the attendant passed the food trays, she smiled at Steven first. Would you like the vegetarian option, sir? That would be fine, Steven replied softly. The suited man scoffed. Figures, he muttered. Vegetarian. Of course. Steven ignored him again. The man wasn't used to being ignored. He leaned closer. You think you're better than me or something? Sitting there with your little book, quoting life advice, Steven turned slightly, his gaze calm but firm. I don't think I'm better than anyone. Sure doesn't look that way, the man shot back. You've got this holier-than-thou attitude. Who do you think you are, some kind of monk? Steven didn't flinch. Just a man trying to travel in peace. A few rows back, passengers were starting to pay attention again. The young woman who'd been filming earlier adjusted her camera slightly, her expression tense. The man laughed bitterly. Travel in peace, huh? You sound like one of those washed-up actors trying to stay relevant. Steven's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in patience. You seem angry, he said. Sometimes anger comes from pain. You might want to look at that. That line hit harder than any insult could have. The man's expression hardened. "Don't play therapist with me." He reached for his coffee, knocking the edge of his tray. Some spilled on Steven's sleeve. "Oh, great," Steven murmured, dabbing it with a napkin. The man smirked. "My bad. Guess you'll survive." A ripple of discomfort moved through the section. Even the flight attendant noticed, stepping closer. "Is everything okay here, gentlemen?" Steven nodded calmly. "Everything's fine." The attendant hesitated, glancing between them, then walked away reluctantly. Moments later, turbulence struck, sharp and sudden. The plane dipped, jolting everyone. Gasps echoed as drinks tipped and cutlery rattled. The arrogant man gripped his seat handles tightly, his bravado slipping away. For a moment, panic flashed across his face. Steven, steady as ever, reached out instinctively, placing a reassuring hand on the man's arm. "Breathe," he said softly. "You're safe." The man froze, caught between fear and pride. He didn't pull away, not immediately. The turbulence lasted a few seconds more, then eased. When it was over, the man exhaled shakily and looked away, embarrassed. "Didn't need your help," he muttered. Steven simply replied, "Didn't say you did." A subtle silence lingered, not hostile, but heavy. The kind that follows truth. After a few minutes, the man's shoulders relaxed. His voice lowered. You really don't get angry, do you?" Steven looked up from his book. "What would anger change?" The man didn't answer. He turned toward the window, avoiding eye contact. For the first time since the flight began, he was quiet. Across the aisle, the young woman whispered to the passenger beside her, "He's handling this like a monk." The older passenger smiled knowingly. "That's Steven Seagal. He's been through far worse than an arrogant seatmate." The woman's eyes widened. "Wait, that's Steven Seagal?" The man beside her nodded slowly. "Yep, the real one." The whisper spread, subtle but steady. Row by row, people began realizing who was sitting there. The calm man reading The Art of Peace was one of the most famous martial artists in the world. And yet, he hadn't said a word about it. If you were in Steven's seat, would you speak up or stay silent? The rest of the flight would test not Steven's strength, but the other man's humility. Because soon the entire cabin would know the truth. The cabin had grown quieter now. The arrogant man beside Steven leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, pretending to nap, though his restlessness gave him away. His hand tapped against his armrest every few seconds. He wasn't comfortable. Steven, on the other hand, remained perfectly still. He had gone back to his reading, his calm energy steadying the air around him. It was a strange contrast. One man radiating noise even in silence, the other radiating peace even amid tension. A few rows back, the young woman who had filmed earlier finally pulled out her phone again. She typed Steven Seagal into a search bar, glancing from her screen to the man by the window seat. Her eyes widened. It was him. She whispered to her seatmate, a middle-aged man in a navy blazer. "That's Steven Seagal. Look." The man leaned forward, squinting. Recognition dawned instantly. "You're right. That's the guy from Under Siege and Above the Law." Their whispers began to spread, quietly at first like a ripple in still water. A teenager across the aisle heard, pulled out his phone and whispered to his mother. "Mom, that's Steven Seagal." Within minutes, half of first class knew. Phones suddenly came out. People Googled his photos to confirm. Some were shocked that the man sitting so quietly was the legendary martial artist and actor. The man whose calm was famous long before this flight. Meanwhile, the man in the gray suit remained blissfully unaware. He stirred awake, noticing a few curious stares. "What's everyone looking at?" he muttered, adjusting his jacket. No one answered. A couple of passengers exchanged looks but said nothing. The respect in the air had shifted, from indifference to quiet admiration for Steven. When the flight attendant returned to check on the cabin, she smiled more warmly this time. "Mr. Seagal, would you like another drink? Tea, perhaps?" The man beside him froze. He turned his head slowly. "Wait, what did you just call him?" The attendant blinked, a little startled. "Mr. Seagal." The man sat upright, staring at Steven. "Steven Seagal? As in, the movie guy?" Steven set his book down gently and nodded. "That's me." The man's jaw fell open. "You're kidding." "I mean, you're him?" A faint, knowing smile appeared on Steven's face. "Last time I checked." A chuckle rolled through a few nearby passengers. The tension that had once filled the cabin now turned into an almost electric energy. People smiling, whispering, nudging one another. The man stammered. Wow. I didn't recognize you. Steven's voice remained even. That's all right. Recognition isn't required for respect. The words landed like a quiet thunderclap. Every passenger who heard them knew exactly what he meant. The man swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance melting into discomfort. He rubbed the back of his neck, his voice suddenly small. Hey, listen, man, I might have said a few things earlier that... Steven stopped him gently. You don't need to explain. Just treat the next person better than you treated me. That's enough. The flight attendant smiled softly, visibly moved. The passengers around them, many of whom had been watching the scene unfold since the boarding gate, began whispering things like, "He's so composed, and that's real class." The man sank back into his seat, eyes down, silent for the first time since the flight took off. He didn't even touch his drink. The young woman who had filmed earlier typed something into her phone. Witnessed Steven Seagal handle pure disrespect with grace. The real martial art is self-control. Her post was short, but by the time the flight landed, it would already be spreading online. Steven closed his book and looked out the window. The sunlight reflected off the clouds like gold. His calm had transformed the atmosphere. No lectures, no anger, just quiet dignity. For many on that flight, it was the first time they truly understood what strength looked like without violence. The tension that had filled the first-class cabin earlier had now transformed into something entirely different and a hush of respect. Everyone who had recognized Steven Seagal seemed to sense that they were witnessing something rare, a quiet masterclass in humility and strength. The man in the gray suit, once loud and arrogant, now sat stiffly in his seat. His bravado had drained away. Every few seconds he glanced sideways at Steven, as if searching for the right words to undo his earlier behavior. Steven, however, seemed unconcerned. He leaned back, eyes closed, breathing evenly. To him, the flight was no different than before. Finally, unable to bear the silence, the man spoke. Look, Mr. Seagal, I owe you an apology. I was out of line earlier. Steven opened his eyes slowly and studied the man. You don't owe me anything, he said quietly. But you do owe yourself honesty about why you felt the need to treat a stranger that way. The man looked down. I don't know. I guess I judged too fast. I've had a rough week. Business has been bad, people. People just annoy me lately. Steven nodded thoughtfully. Pain makes us lash out. But peace, real peace, means breaking that pattern. The man nodded, embarrassed. You're right. I guess I let my ego talk for me. Steven gave a faint smile. Ego's a loud companion. It'll drown out your better self if you let it. Across the cabin, passengers listened silently. The young woman who'd been filming earlier lowered her phone, no longer out of fear of missing a moment but out of respect. What was happening now wasn't entertainment. It was something meaningful. The man shifted in his seat again. I've seen your movies, you know, he admitted sheepishly. Never thought I'd end up sitting next to you. And acting like a complete jerk, Steven chuckled softly. Life has a funny way of teaching us lessons in unexpected classrooms. That earned a few quiet smiles from nearby passengers. Even the flight attendants paused in their service, glancing over with admiration. Then unexpectedly the man spoke again, this time with sincerity. You could have embarrassed me. You could have told everyone who you were from the start. Steven shook his head. And what would that prove? Respect shouldn't depend on fame. It should come from decency. The words settled over the cabin like a gentle weight. Every person listening could feel the truth of it. Even those who hadn't spoken a word since boarding looked down, reflecting on how often they too judged without knowing. The man sighed deeply. You're right. You handled this way better than I deserved, Steven replied softly. Sometimes we learn most from the moments we regret. Just then, the seatbelt sign flicked on, a gentle reminder that the flight was nearing its descent. The city lights of Los Angeles shimmered below, dots of gold and white against the dark ocean. The arrogant man, no longer arrogant at all, turned to Steven once more. Thank you, he said quietly, for not making me the villain I acted like. Steven turned toward him with a calm, knowing look. You made yourself human, that's better. The man smiled faintly, humbled. Guess you really do live like those Zen masters you talk about. Steven looked out the window again. Peace isn't about talking. It's about choosing silence when your pride wants to speak. For a long moment, the cabin was silent again. Not the awkward kind from earlier, but peaceful, united, reflective. As the plane began its descent, the man sat back, clearly changed. The loud businessman who had once mocked a stranger now seemed smaller, quieter, and maybe for the first time at peace. Across the aisle, the teenage boy who'd recognized Steven earlier whispered, "He's even cooler in real life." His mother smiled softly. "Because he doesn't need to prove it." As the plane dipped toward the runway, the cabin lights dimmed, and in that hush before landing, everyone understood that Steven Seagal hadn't just taught one man a lesson. He'd reminded an entire plane what true respect looks like. The plane touched down smoothly, tires screeching softly against the runway. The cabin lights brightened, and everyone began to stir from that reflective silence that had hung in the air since Steven's last words. Seat belts clicked open. Bags shifted from the overhead bins. But even with all the routine sounds of landing, there was still a feeling of something different, like everyone knew they had witnessed something meaningful on this flight. The man in the gray suit, once brimming with ego, now seemed like a completely different person. His shoulders had dropped, his tone softened. He looked at Steven with genuine remorse. "Mr. Seagal, he began, but his words faltered. Steven simply turned toward him and nodded once. "You already said what matters. No need to repeat it." The man smiled faintly, grateful for the grace he was being shown. "You're a better man than me. Most people would have embarrassed me in front of everyone." Steven shrugged slightly. Respect doesn't grow from humiliation. It grows from understanding. Before the man could respond, one of the flight attendants came over, clearly still moved by what had unfolded. "Mr. Seagal," she said softly, "I just want to say that was really something, the way you handled that situation." Steven smiled warmly. "Thank you. Sometimes calm is the only weapon you need." The attendant nodded, visibly inspired. "I wish more people acted that way when they travel." The passengers behind them were already whispering again, but this time their words were kind. "He's so grounded. You'd never think someone that famous could be so humble. I'll never forget how he handled that guy." The man in the gray suit took a deep breath, then stood as the seatbelt sign went off. "Mr. Seagal, if you'd let me, I'd like to carry your bag for you." Steven chuckled quietly. "That's not necessary. I insist," the man said. "Please." Steven looked at him for a moment, not to test him, but to truly see if he meant it. Then slowly, he handed him the small leather carry-on. "All right," he said simply. The man took it carefully as if holding something fragile. "Thank you for everything," he murmured. As the line to D-board moved forward, the other passengers began smiling at Steven as they passed. A few shook his hand. One older man patted his shoulder. "You're a class act, Mr. Seagal," he said. Steven only replied, "We all have a choice, every moment, to make peace or make noise." The young woman who had filmed the first confrontation stepped closer before leaving the plane. "I didn't mean to record everything," she said shyly, "but people need to see how you handled it. The world could use more examples like that." Steven gave her a kind smile. "If it helps someone be kinder tomorrow, then I'm all for it." The arrogant man, now visibly humbled, stood just behind him carrying Steven's bag all the way down the jet bridge. Other passengers noticed, but instead of laughing, they respected the gesture. As they entered the terminal, a few airport staff members recognized Steven immediately. "Mr. Seagal, welcome to LA," one of them said cheerfully. The man in the suit stopped in his tracks, realizing just how much more embarrassing his earlier behavior could have been. He turned to Steven one last time. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but thank you for giving it anyway." Steven placed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Forgiveness isn't about who deserves it. It's about who needs peace to move on." The man nodded, eyes misty. "You've got that peace thing figured out, huh?" Steven smiled. "Still learning. Every day." The crowd began to move again, dispersing into the busy airport terminal. Cameras flashed discreetly as a few passengers whispered and smiled, and though Steven disappeared into the flow of travelers, the impact of that flight lingered behind. On every passenger, every attendant, and especially one man in a gray suit who had learned that real strength doesn't shout. It listens. Do you think Steven did the right thing by staying calm instead of calling him out? Tell us what you would have done in his place. By the next morning, the entire internet had seen it. The young woman's video, the one she'd filmed quietly from her seat in row 2B, was everywhere. It opened with a still frame of Steven Seagal sitting calmly as the man beside him sneered, and then unfolded into a 3-minute masterclass in composure, kindness, and silent strength. The caption read, "When you insult a stranger in first class, and he turns out to be Steven Seagal." Within hours, the clip had racked up over 50 million views on TikTok, then spread to YouTube, Twitter, and every major news outlet. Comment sections were flooded with praise and reflection. This is what real power looks like. He didn't need to fight. His peace said it all. The other guy's face when he realized who it was, priceless. Even major aviation pages reposted it, calling it a lesson in humility for passengers and staff alike. CNN and BBC ran short segments about the Steven Seagal flight encounter, while entertainment networks debated the deeper message behind it. Some called it a celebrity moment of grace. Others said it was a mirror to everyday bias. But for Steven, the noise meant nothing. He was sitting quietly in his Los Angeles home, sipping green tea, watching the sunrise. His phone buzzed, nonstop. Publicists, journalists, producers, all wanting him to give a statement. He declined every single one. Finally, his assistant walked in and said, "Sir, everyone's talking about the video. They want to know what you think. Maybe you should post something?" Steven set his cup down gently. "They already know what I think," he said. "They saw it. But people want to hear it from you," she pressed. He thought for a moment, then opened his laptop. Within minutes, he typed a short message and posted it to his verified account. Respect doesn't depend on status, clothes, or fame. It depends on how you treat people when you think no one is watching. That single post gathered 2 million likes within the first hour. Celebrities, athletes, and even law enforcement officers reposted it with words like powerful, timeless, and needed. Meanwhile, the man from the flight, the one in the gray suit, released a statement of his own. His tone was completely different now. "I didn't recognize who I was sitting beside, but that's no excuse. What I said to Mr. Seagal was disrespectful, and he had every right to respond in anger, but he didn't. Instead, he showed patience and wisdom. I learned a lesson that I'll never forget." The apology went viral too. Some mocked him, but most applauded his honesty. Later that week, a journalist caught up with Steven outside a charity event in Los Angeles. Cameras flashed as he walked by, but he paused just long enough to answer one question. "Mr. Seagal, millions say you handled that situation like a monk. What was going through your mind at that moment?" Steven smiled faintly, his trademark calm never fading. "When people act from ego," he said softly, "they invite conflict. When you act from peace, you disarm it." The clip aired that night on multiple networks, solidifying the story's message, one not about fame, but about character. Back in the skies, even airline staff began sharing the video during their training sessions. One instructor reportedly played it for new recruits, saying, "This is how you recognize dignity no matter who it belongs to." In just a week, the world had turned a moment of arrogance into a global conversation about humility, respect, and human decency. As for Steven, he continued as always, quietly, privately, and with that same measured calm that had diffused a tense situation 30,000 feet in the air. That night, scrolling through the hundreds of positive messages, he came across one that made him smile. It read, "You taught me that silence can speak louder than shouting." He turned off his phone, set it aside, and whispered to himself, not as a celebrity, but as a man who'd seen enough of the world to know what truly matters. Peace is strength. The message, captured, shared, and remembered, continued to echo across millions of screens. If you believe real power is staying calm when others lose control, type respect in the comments below.